I'd like to introduce Dr. Carlos Madrid. He's already been talking a lot of interesting stuff, but he's a researcher and assistant professor at the Micronesian Area Research Center, University of Guam. He holds a PhD in contemporary history from the Universidad Complutense de Madrid. He's very familiar with Guam's Spanish history. He's an expert on Spanish colonial times and records as they pertain to the Marianas. And he's written a book entitled Beyond Distances, Governance, Politics, and Deportation in the Mariana Islands from 1870 to 1877. And he's here to talk to us about one particular very interesting story, and I'm sure it will lead to lots of other stories, and has very much to do with the judicial history of Guam and the judicial independence and all kinds of things like that. So thank you for your time, Doctor.
Thank you, Chuck, for the introduction and for giving me the opportunity to be here today. As I was saying, for me this is truly a privilege. In a sense, it's completing the work of researching and covering what is unknown, and there is this component of delivering it. I see no point in writing a paper from something that is unknown, and then that paper, who's going to read it later on? Knowledge, historic knowledge, like any kind of knowledge, has to apply into daily life. And I cannot do that. I'm a foreigner, I'm a scholar, I'm a nerdy guy that is into the documents, and there are several applications of this kind of information, several, that I cannot undertake for cultural industries, which is a source of development. And in Europe, we live out of those things. In Spain, we get like 60 million tourists, and we are based in delivering things to do for the tourists, enjoying food, enjoying music, enjoying daily traditional life. And Guam and the Chamorro culture has a unique background, unique. So unique that is the only in the world in which three of the main civilizations converge. Civilization in terms of natural resources. The culture of rice, belongs to Southeast Asia. The Marianas is the only archipelago in Oceania that had rice before the arrival of the Westerners. The culture of rice, the culture of corn that the Spanish brought with them from Mexico. That culture of corn that incorporated already indigenous traits from Mexico, from the Aztecs. And they get incorporated into the Spanish package, to put it like that, and like metate, tiza, well, several words that are incorporated into Chamorro and into Spanish come from indigenous Aztec words. The culture of rice, the culture of corn, and the culture of the coconut converging in Guam. There is a whole, that's a venue for representing and for interacting with the natural resources that Guam can develop. Now, there is a problem, there is a political component to the way we perceive this past. This political component has to do with colonialism, lack of self-governance, abuses, and I'm not just referring to the Spanish past, but to many, that colonial reality has carried on to this day, in the sense of non-self-governing territory. I'm not going to go there, but I know as far as 1899 is concerned, as far as 1950 is concerned, Guam was a colony, for sure. And that's difficult to relate with that past. It's like we can, and it will be like relating with that past in terms of familiarity is like endorsing the political component that it has. So that's one of the challenges that has to be faced. But I'm going away from the topic. I was hired in 2004, I believe, by the Northern Mariana Islands to conduct a research on the Spanish political dissenters that were sent to Guam and to Saipan in the 1870s. Shortly after the American Civil War, there was a revolution in Spain, democratic revolution. Interestingly enough, by the way, the people was carrying, when democracy was promulgated and the Queen was expelled and the people of Spain was mesmerized with happiness, they were carrying two flags, the flag of Spain and the flag of the United States. And the United States and Switzerland was the only two countries that recognized the Spanish Republic. All the monarchies in Europe, when they saw that what was happening to the Queen of Spain, they were like, they retrieved their ambassadors, etc., etc. Very interesting because 30 years later, in 1898, the conflict of interest is going to be very different. Anyway, what happened is that democracy in Spain failed. There was a coup d'etat, military coup d'etat, that cancelled the democracy, and all the characters that played major roles in that democratic effort were punished and sent to exile. During that period, death penalty had been abolished, so they couldn't be executed as it could have happened before. These things were, by the way, happening the same way in France. The Commune of Paris in 1871, they made a huge revolution. Communism, anarchism, the avant-garde, the political avant-garde of those days, and they were deported to Nouvelle Caledonie, to New Caledonia. The Spanish government of the coup d'etat tried to do the same thing. Well, let's mirror them because it was chaotic. So they deported 700 people. Among them, the intellectual leaders of Europe of those days, people that Engels and Bakunin, the intellectuals of anarchism and communism in Europe were looking to. Those were deported here. They were deported to the Philippines. The Spanish Governor General of the Philippines said, like, what am I going to do with 700 political leaders in a country that has so many issues? So he sent them to Guam. And the governor of Guam said, look, what am I going to do with 700 people that is full of ideological background? So he sent them to Saipan. He scattered them. Rota, the intellectual leaders to Rota, the other people to Saipan, and 400 of them to Saipan, to Guam. 400. Each family had to host one, because there was no way the community could sustain all of them. The Spanish government was sending rations, food, every 3 months. Rice, wine, food, bread. Anyway, that was my mission, to research about that episode. I was supposed to write a report about it, but then I started to research that process of finding, like, wow, there is so much to know. Every document that I find that is so filled with information that my report became my master's dissertation and later a book, which is just 7 years of the history of Guam, and it's 300 pages. Now, there are many issues that we could be discussing about, but one thing struck my attention, that it was one character that was living in Agaña in those same days, and that we know nothing about. I knew nothing about it. Now, talking about the Spanish in Guam and in the Marianas, what will come to mind is this, the Spanish conquistador, and yet even this same image is non-existent. This is wrong. This is chronologically non-existent. If we were to apply the right uniform for that, is the Napoleonic times. But the perception of the history of Guam has been altered for a complex number of reasons. In that these realities that in other countries are seen, in the case of Guam, are more or less obscure. Am I making sense? Okay. We are not even going to talk about the Napoleonic times. The uniforms of the period that I'm referring will be more or less. They will be more or less like this. Actually, not more or less like those. This will be in the 1870s. Remember, in the 1870s, the world is changing completely. There is a new channel, a canal in Suez, opened 2 years before, 1869, that has shortened. Before, it took the Spanish to get here 6 months, because in those days the Americas were no longer Spanish. The Spanish had only Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, and the Marianas. And there was no point to have the Marianas from the colonial point of view, from the exploitation point of view. It made no sense. But the inertia of keeping the sovereignty held it. And because it was a Spanish territory, and several of the Chamorro people had a Spanish background. Now, in the 1870s, is the Industrial Revolution as well. The second Industrial Revolution is a world changing, and we are seeing now that even politically, ideologically, This will be Agaña. We see, you can see there for Santa Agueda. Apuga.
Okay.
With the stones that later on it lost, but I think ideally it could be restored in the same way. And if I were to say, I would put a huge Guam flag on every Spanish fort in Guam. Just a flag of Guam, but that's a personal view. What we are referring is not the Agaña of the 1700s, or the Guam of the 1700s, in which the Chamorro people was basically exploited for labor, receiving very little salary, if any, complaining that they were not receiving salary. Now, one of the interesting things of the Spanish colonization, the system of colonization, because it dates back before modern times, before the Industrial Revolution, before the Declaration of the Rights of Man, before the birth of the nation state as we know it, is that the idea behind it is the incorporation of those colonies into the motherland. So what they do is transfer institutions, realities, technology, religion, cultural practices, transfer it to the colonized territories. From the cultural point of view, the indigenous cultural point of view, that is devastating. From the point of view of themselves in the 1600s, in the 1500s, that's the civilizing mission that later on in the 1800s the British are going to have, the US is going to have in the early 20th century, civilizing the white man's burden. That's the theory behind it, but in reality it's the exploitation of labor, the exploitation of the natural resources for the benefit of the motherland in exchange of institutions, etc., etc. Now, but there is a big difference. What we find in the Spanish colonies, we find social realities and institutional realities that we don't find anywhere else. Agaña as a city is older than Chicago, than Adelaida, than Melbourne. It's a city with the title of city since 1686. And with this term city, it goes a number of institutions. That is, it has a luggage with it. It carries a baggage that is self-governance. It's implicit to it, as a byproduct of the colonization, not as an intentional result of the colonization. Are you following?
Yes.
That byproduct, you will understand why all the former Spanish colonies became republics. Mexico, Cuba, Peru, there are 22 countries. The Philippines had universities, newspapers, water irrigation systems. In 1899, Filipinos, teachers at the university. When other European colonies in Southeast Asia, they didn't even have secondary schools. Those differences, by pointing out, I'm not endorsing colonialism, I'm putting it in context that it's because that system of colonization started centuries before the development of the state nation. That goes for the context. I don't want to elaborate into that. We know about Agaña, the administrative center of Guam, right? In which a number of institutions were there, military, religious, educational, for local governance. This is the only known picture of those group of deportees, the political leaders that came to Guam, deported, well, not they came, they were taken. The Spanish deportees, deportado, we will be saying in Chamorro. Now, one of them wrote a book, a school teacher. These are school teachers, intellectuals, some of them petty thieves, ignorant, or they didn't know how to read and write. Another of them was a writer, a poet, and an intellectual. One of them, a school teacher, wrote a book 15 years later. He didn't say he was a deportee, but he was writing to promote the colonization of the Caroline Islands, and I just found by coincidence, because of the name and the place where he was born, that he has been a deportee. Memory and project and regulations to colonize the Marianas, the Carolines, and Palaos, 1885, 10 years after he was deported. And then I read the book in the light of, if this man knew, what is he saying? And it's very unique. Even though it's not his topic, he elaborates on, he gives names. When other Spanish scholars or European scholars, they just talk like the Indios, the locals, the naturales, the indigenous, they don't know this, they don't know that. This book by this man gives very specific details, like the rich chamorros dress like this, the poor chamorros dress like that, the women do this, the women do that. And then he mentions about individuals, and he mentions one in particular, Luis Baza, that prominent in intelligence, the Luis Baza, the most unfortunate by his arrogance and independence of mind. Now this Luis Baza was a surgeon, was an officer of the local militia. The Spanish had two battalions, not battalions, it's units with 50 soldiers each. One by Spanish soldiers, one by Chamorros. And they have to patrol the streets at night, they have to light they have to signal if there's a ship coming. Daily, they have to parade in official occasions. Those militias, by the way, that's what kept, in the time of the whalers, in the early 1800s, one of the safest places to be was Guam. When in other places of Micronesia, Westerners and whalers, they were kidnapping indigenous people to sell them as slaves or to exploit their labor elsewhere, like in Peru or in Hawaii. Those things didn't happen in Guam. And credit has to be given to those militias. Luis Baza was the sergeant of the Chamorro militia. And there was an issue described in the book that he started to have problems with the Spanish governor. The Spanish governor was taking the advantage that this place was so uncommunicated that he was enriching himself, getting commission for everything he did. He got a commission. And Luis Baza refused to yield to that attitude. And he used one tool that the Spanish government had developed since centuries before, that is called la residencia. I brought an article about it, la residencia. There are 2 copies. If somebody's interested, they can read it. La residencia was the trial that every Spanish governor had to take after his term. There will be an amount of time in which every neighbor, every person is free to go and anonymously or giving their name, make any complaints they have about that governor. And all of the governors had their own residencia. Of course, they found the ways of bypassing it, or some people was afraid of testifying. But this particular governor in the 1870s, in the late 1860s, was so abusive, so obnoxious, that everyone complained, even the priest, who he had been screened at, and there was. But when the judge came and there was the moment to testify, everyone was afraid of pressing charges for it. No one pressed charges. The list of complaints is in the book. It's amazing. By the way, I printed also some of the pages of the book. There are no more copies of the book. It's out of print, but I think they have very few at Mark. But I printed some of the pages discussing the Luis Baza case, and they could be available for whoever wants to read it. Only Luis Baza pressed charges against this governor. Only him. And there was, he lost. He was deported to Rota, he was whipped, he lost his house because the governor had so much power, even then in the 1870s, had so much power that he could manipulate institutions, whatever, as he wanted. And the unique case of this is that Luis Baza eventually won the case. And he had the governor paying for the cost of the trial, reimbursing him. There is this term in the legal term of compensation. You have to pay compensation to Luis Baza. He had to pay compensation to the Spanish government for the other abuses that he committed and were proven. And he was sentenced never to return to the Mariana Islands, never to return to the Philippines, and never to set a foot in the city of Madrid. So he had to leave his career and live elsewhere. Well, I've been trying to track the descendants, but I've been unable. He was married to a Chamorro woman, this governor from the Tudela family. In fact, It's very interesting. He was married, and one of the things that this research shows is that there was a class of Chamorro women, entrepreneurial, all throughout the second half of the 1800s. And one of these women, Josefa Anderson, that was mestiza, half Westerner, half Chamorro. She was indulging in business. She subscribed to women magazines from Spain that she would receive every month. And she, of course, she associated with the governor. Associated, well, I don't know. There were rumors in Agaña that they were going out, but eventually the governor married the daughter of Josefa Anderson to them. And they were, when the sentence came, they were expelled. Both. Now, talking of descendants, I was able to track down the descendants of Luis Basa, and it's very interesting because it seems that that attitude of resistance and political consciousness carried on in the family. One of them would be Father Dueñas, who was killed during World War II, and León Guerrero, this man who went with Baltasar Bordallo in the 1930s to Washington to claim U.S. citizenship for the Chamorro. He was the grandson of Luis Basa. Even the governor, Eddie Calvo, is also a descendant of Luis Basa. The unique character of this is that, well, we have this reality in which there is one Spanish governor, abusive, cruel, taking advantage of both Spanish and Chamorros, and there is one individual that he's able to face this reality and succeed. And most interesting is that the attitude of Luis Basa was not just against the corrupt governor. The next governor, which is this man, Luis de Bañez, he was not corrupt. He was put there by the democratic government. He was described to be in the far left. And yet, Luis Basa and him clashed. And that governor sentenced Luis Basa to serve two years of prison. There was public works, not prison, but public works. And he had to do it. And he appealed. Luis Basa appealed again. And he won the case again. He won the case. Like, no, this cannot happen. There was the report of the High Court in the Philippines. This cannot happen. That one innocent being sentenced, etc., etc. So the attitude of Luis Basa is not just against the corrupt governor. This governor was not so corrupt. He was, in fact, he cleaned the administration from corrupt officers. And there is a passing reference in another document in which he says, this Luis Basa that is boasting about his Republican ideas. Now the concept Republican in those days is to say, would be like to say these communist ideas or Democrat, actually. The Republicans were the ones in power in Spain, the ones that had succeeded in the revolution. And here we have, in the other side of the world, in the city of Agaña, the sergeant, the officer, that is boasting to whom? He's going to boast? To the Spanish? He's boasting to the Chamorros, to the people of Agaña, about democracy, resistance to the authority, legal codes, etc. By the way, when I say Agaña, we have to keep in mind something that is invisible in I think the way the history, well, in conventional books, we could say, that is the division in between the capital and the villages. Something that, if you know people who grew in Guam in the 20th century, they were still there, no? Like the villagers, they would say tal, tate, the people of Agaña, like the ones from that are supposed to be a little awkward or not cosmopolitan. Well, that has been there for at least 150 years, and that's common to everywhere. You find that division in between the rural and the urban. The people from the cities, they see themselves as superior, and the people of the villages, they see themselves as superior in some things, as inferior in others, vice versa. Well, those dynamics, one was part of it as well. A very unique case, and that being said, my whole point of the presentation is, if you have the chance to read the book or to read what I passed, the dossier that I passed, I think this man who did so much for the history, for the legal system of Guam, he deserves some kind of recognition. And I mean, taking to court a Spanish governor and succeeding and having him expelled and getting compensation for that. And I was hoping that maybe, I mean, I don't know what is the right venue for that commemoration, or if there can be some kind of courtroom or something like that named after Luis Basa, or any sort of recognition that is not, that I cannot undertake, but it's just like, if you could lobby for it or do it after you read and after you come to the same conclusion, if you do. In my case, I was so captured by it that I dedicated the book to him. It was made in memory of Luis Basa. In a way also for my family, because in my family there were also fighters for democracy, and I felt very associated with him. To close down this presentation, let me do a little overview on the institutional representation of this state that it was existing in the 1800s. That is not just, I think nowadays we have the perception that the Chamorros were like in the 1600s, all the way until the Navy, the US Navy came, and there was a complete transformation, 3 times actually, 3 or 4 times in like any other country. Like I'm sure the US is not the same, Spain is not the same than 1820s. It's completely different. In Guam, we find the same reality, the change, the modernization to a certain extent of the social realities. Now, the institutions that I'm referring, let me put it back in this aerial view taken in the early Navy times. No, this is the 1930s, in fact. The church, right? The Plaza España, the Kiosco, we are all familiar with this, the 3 arches, the government palace, the tribunal, very important, the city hall. That by law, the city hall, the mayors of the city and of the villages could only be indigenous, according to Spanish laws. And they have to be chosen by election, by electoral process, in which the adult males will select 3 candidates, and the governor will pick one of the 3. Traditionally, the governor will pick the one that had more votes, or the one who spoke more Spanish. That was also a problem. The school for girls, the school for boys that cannot be seen here, and that school, that was the San Juan de Letrán school, the oldest educational institution in the Western sense of the term.
Where's the court there?
The court, it was part of the compound, of the government compound. That's why I always hear like the governor's palace, and the right term for it and the way it appears in the documents is the government palace, Palacio del Gobierno, because it's a compound in which the family of the governor lives, the archives are held, the secretary of the governor works, the clerks, all of them Chamorros, by the way, work. Imagine, by the way, the clerks that are copying all the communication in times that there's no photocopies, no photographs. They are copying, they have to duplicate every document.
Scriveners. Scriveners.
Scriveners, yes.
Yeah.
Imagine how much power they have, because they know everything. They were well paid, of course, but they have a huge amount of information. And
Sorry, what's the big prominent building there in the corner? That's the... Yes.
This is the cathedral.
So it's not where the cathedral is today?
Yes, the door of the cathedral nowadays will be here.
Oh, okay.
The museum is being built here. You see, when we take that street that is after the museum, after the whiteboards, to go to the post office, the street in between passes where the tribunal used to be. Let me see if we have photos of those. Well, this is the church of the Spanish times. They have to build, anecdote, they have to build this little tower because they ordered a bell from Manila, and they send it too big to fit in the door or to fit through the window. By the time they realized, like, really?
The Chamorros did that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
No, the Spanish. Imagine, so they have to use the stones from an old fort that it was where, do you remember in what's his name, Skinner Plaza, there was this big kiosk?
Yes.
That was just taken down months ago.
Yes.
There, a little bit forward towards the sea, there was a castle in the 1870s, and they dismantled it because it had no use, and part of those stones were used to build this little tower to put the bell.
Is the large bell currently in the cathedral?
Yeah, one of those is, but I don't know if exactly this one. The night it was being played on December 25, they were being playing it for the first time. It fell, and it killed a young boy that was just there.
Really?
And there was nothing they could do for him. From the Nego family. Now, this is the plaza. You will identify the three arches, right?
Mhm.
This was the storehouse. At times it was also the archives and the office of the judiciary, but mainly in the government palace.
So we're looking, this is,
This will be the
East.
cathedral.
east,
Yes.
the east part.
Up here somewhere will be the fort,
Mm.
and the old district court of the 20th century, I mean, it will be somewhere here, right?
You'd probably be looking
So the
down the road there and see Department of Administration, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yes,
down.
exactly, exactly. In those days there was the barracks. Now, well, I mean, I don't have time to elaborate, but this year is the 130th anniversary of one young soldier, José de Salas, in 1884. It was even after Luis Baza. As the governor passed at 8 at night, coming from a walk, he turned around and shot him, and shot the governor.
Who shot the gun?
The sentinel, the Chamorro sentinel, José de Salas. Nobody knows why, but it seems that there was the governor, as he passed, insulted him. Or said something just like disrespectful.
Maybe looked at him. Atan Baba.
Yeah,
And the soldier turned around and shot him.
Did he die?
He died immediately, he was shot in the head.
Wow.
Chamorro soldiers, by the way, were famous even outside of the Marianas, for their marksmanship. There is a continuous references, like how everyone was amazed, like they could with one single bullet, they will go hunting. And then the Spanish officer will say, well, take more, just in case. And someone will say, no, I don't need it. And true, you will go and hunt and come back with the deer.
What happened to De Salas? What
The
happened?
Salas, that's a sad story. The Salas was guilty. The second in command, the Spanish second in command, took the opportunity to make it look like there was a revolt. Something that the Spanish government would panic. They didn't want to hear that. And that officer had subdued the revolt. And to do that, he, let me use this expression, enhancedly interrogated the Chamorro officers of the militia. You need to say they were tortured.
Mm.
And when you enhancedly interrogate somebody, you get confessions that are not real. And that's what happened. They signed confessions that they were not real. So 4 people were killed. Luis de Salas was dead, and the other 3 were taken to Manila for trial. Because the highest court was in Manila, they were sentenced to death. They were returned to Guam because the execution had to be taking place here, and they were executed in the Acaña boat basin on April 10, 1885. One of them was guilty, but the other 3 were innocent.
But
They
not
were
guilty
shot.
of revolution, guilty of manslaughter, I guess it would be.
Like if
Yeah.
you mean if the, we know that there was no intention of revolution because Father Palomo,
Mhm.
he wrote a short history of the Marianas, and he specifies this document, and he said 3 good soldiers were killed when only 1 was responsible because they were tortured by the officers, and that's the only source that we know to find what happened. And the whole trial, the whole judiciary process is nowhere to be found. I have been looking for it, everyone has been looking for it, and then it doesn't exist. It's in the, or maybe it was lost. but it's not like it.
When the judiciary at the time expelled the governor, what was, obviously there was some independence. How did the judiciary, the judge, enforce the judgment to get that governor out? What if the governor said, no, I got military power?
But at that time, the Spanish sent 2 judges. The first one was here only for about a week,
Yeah.
and nobody wanted to testify. And then they sent another one, and by that time the governor was already in Manila. And
Oh.
by the time the sentence had come, he was already in Spain,
Oh,
and that's how it happened. But
so he could have resisted if he was here, maybe if it was.
if he was here, it would be just a matter of time that the Spanish would send a steamer with officers and soldiers, and
Get rid of it.
detain him. Yeah.
I had a question about other, I have an interest in what the church might have been like at that time. Did anyone speak up on behalf of Basa at all? You said the witnesses all left, or no one else pressed their case. Just silence.
Yeah, silence, and probably we can understand it could be like why to get in trouble for something that it may not work. Like it was actually very risky, because if you testify
Yeah.
and it doesn't work, you are exposing yourself to the next governor.
Retaliation.
Retaliation, and who's gonna do that? And for what? Like how long had, by the time they were being asked, it was like 2 years after it happened. Many people just prefer to forget. Women like Rosa Tenorio, Josefa de la Cruz, that they had been, because they didn't want to sell a pig to the governor, they were sentenced to have her hair cut, cropped, and paraded in jubilation through the streets of Agaña. Imagine. And well, he had to pay for it. The governor had to pay for it. But
Oh, in the write-up you provided, you listed several women who
Mhm.
were disgraced. I forget the term you used. We didn't know exactly how to interpret that, so it wasn't necessarily a sexual.
no,
It was something like you just described.
yeah. What I did in that document is to shorten what is
Yeah.
in the book, to summarize it
Yeah.
based on the sentence. But yeah, the humiliation was to parade them, detain in front of all the streets. Remember, in those days, like the public space is where life happens. So that's complete humiliation. And with the haircut, that is very damaging for the identity of an individual. He had to pay 100 pesos for doing that, Moscoso. But not to them, not to the two women who didn't press charges, but to the government by default.
Restitution.
Restitution. This will be the palace that is now. There are plans to rebuild it, and I think very, very interestingly, gobierno político militar. The governor is civil governor and military governor at the same time. That's the letterhead of those days. In front of the government house, right in front, where I said, next to the post office, is where that governor that I was saying that was also against Basa, but he was on the far left, he had built the city hall of Agaña. A huge, relatively huge infrastructure to hold the office of the Chamorro mayor of Agaña. This was his office. This was where the meeting room took place. The mayor of Agaña had, under his command, 80% of the people of the Mariana, because 80% of the people of the Marianas lived in Agaña. And who were his advisors? The cabeza de barangay, the community leaders, the district leaders. The barangay was like a district. It's a structure that the Spanish found in the Philippines and incorporated it and carried here.
They still have it, the barangay.
Yes,
They
in
have
the
it there,
Philippines
yeah.
they do. And well, the principales, the prominent citizens, etc., that they would be meeting here. When Captain Glass came, and he took with him the Spanish governor, and he didn't leave anyone officially in command of the island, Father Palomo and other prominent citizens, they don't go anywhere else, but they go here, where the local authority is, to sign a document saying that the command of the island remains in the power of the local authorities, not in the Spanish officers, nor in any of the American officers. The building was destroyed in World War II, but I think one of the seals, I'm not sure, is the one that is in the Chocolate House, one of the two. But I cannot prove that, so don't quote me on that. That would be, in the Philippines, some of those buildings survive. That would be the Casa Real. What we saw, the tribunal, is the Casa Real, the city hall. There is one other sample of Casa Real in the Marianas, it's in Rota, and that building is from the 1700s. It's as you leave the San Francisco de Borja church, there are some ruins, 200 meters on your left. That's the Casa Real. The town mayor, the Chamorro town mayor, they hold different responsibilities. They conduct elections, they have to gather the taxes, they hold the official seal to authenticate documents, and this is one of it. Every village had its own. In Arahan, Agat, Rota, Saipan, they have to who studied those documents. I think I have another one. Yeah, Merizo. They will hold the position for 2 years or 3. They have to be. They have the right to be called don, not to pay taxes.
So you said 80% of the population, 80% of the population of the Marianas was in Agaña, or 80% of the population of Guam,
Of the Marianas,
of the Marianas?
1870s.
So how did they sustain themselves day to day? Because that's a dense population.
Very dense. Well, it seems that since the 1850s, it has grown so fast that the people started to migrate elsewhere. Like that's when Saipan starts to be repopulated. People asked for land grants to find good, fertile land elsewhere because Agaña was getting too crowded.
So where did the food come from? Ranches?
Ranches in Toto, Mongmon, up to Santa Rosa. Mainly in that area. Then the families that work for the government. The Sumai is also growing as a village in those days, supplying the whaling ships. So yeah, it's very interesting, but it remains to be studied. Like what is really happening? I suspect that it's the villages. Like Agaña is attracting people from the villages since 1828, when the government gives land to the inhabitants, to the Chamorro, to whoever cultivates the land, and then allows free trade with foreign ships. And that's when we see the interaction between the Spanish and the Chamorro. Until then, Chamorro had no Spanish borrowings, and Spanish was just Spanish until 1800. I had a document from the 1799 written in Chamorro. We are studying it. In fact, we're going to do a presentation probably in 2 weeks. And it has no Spanish borrowings other than pants. And it has been 130 years after the Spanish.
Pants, meaning the word pants?
Yeah, calzones. That's about it. Or maybe palicura, a few others. After 130 years. So it seems that the villages and Agaña were 2 different worlds. And it's only when the whaling ships and the free trade and when there is this modernization happening, when it starts to make sense. And by the way, further suspect, this is the cutting edge, I think is due to one character in particular, Don Luis de Torres, who is full, his mother was full-blooded Chamorro woman, and the father was a Spanish born in Guam. The father was the one who built the building with the 3 arches, and his name is in the code. And this Luis de Torres was chosen to be vice governor, and he spent 12 years of his life researching and studying ancient culture. He's the one who gives information to Freycinet, to Kotzebue, a huge amount of information. He went by canoe to the Caroline Islands to reconnect Guam with the Caroline Islands and establish yearly trips. And why would he do that if the Spanish government didn't care much about it? To the Spanish government, it didn't matter if the Caroline Islands trade with Guam or not. It didn't matter at all. Why this person spent 6 years of his life and risked his life to do that, being half-blooded Chamorro and who has been studying ancient Chamorro culture? That's the source of the national, that's the figure that in other countries, in Mexico, in Peru, that's the source of independentism. That's the figure, that's the Simón Bolívar, the one that incorporates the Western world and the indigenous world, and is none of the two anymore. You understand what I mean?
The bridge.
Yeah, the new, that new blossom or new, I don't know how to say it.
Synthesis. Maybe.
Yeah. And the Spanish are against them because it represents, eventually what is going to happen, independence. Let me finish. Well, collecting of taxes.
So you say that the father of your country, sort of, like George Washington.
Yes, exactly. That's the national figure. His house, by the way, was, where the, well, I cannot go into this, like the parking lot of the, what is that building? Where the Senate in Agaña. The legislature. The parking lot, I think there. A little bit farther down, that was his house.
His name was?
Luis de Torres. That's the source, I believe, of the ascendancies that the Torres family had throughout the 1800s and up to the 1900s. Just moral prestige, because of his figure
Mm.
and other members of the family. Father Paloma was. Remember when I said that the governor was shot by Jose de Salas, was killed? One of the persons that testifies is one descendant of Luis de Torres, who, doesn't matter what he says, but he's working as a private instructor. He has a private school on his own. Why will anyone indulge into doing a private school unless you are really hoping to promote literacy, culture, etc., etc.? Because I don't think he was getting wealthy by that. We find that in the same Torres family, that attitude, at least in the 1800s.
So was that a receipt for the school, or?
No, for the taxes.
For
This is
taxes.
one of the responsibilities that the mayor of every village had to undertake.
Mm.
Provincial tax. Initially, Chamorros were exempted of this tax. I think actually for this particular one in perpetuity, because of the population when it happened at the beginning. It was so dramatic that there was no sense in extracting further taxes from the Chamorros. This explained the extraction of taxes, why the Spanish, when the depopulation happened, and you will see in several books that the Spanish killed the Chamorros, and there were like massacres after massacres. I'm sure there were instances of terrible violence and terror, but the Spanish were not aiming to eliminate the Chamorros, because if the Chamorros died, there's no way to sustain the colonization. That's the only source that they had here, to extract resources, to tax the people, and make them pay for the colonization. That's why when the depopulation happened, the Spanish spent 200 years trying to repopulate the island by sending migrants from the Philippines, Chinese, Spanish, exploring possibilities, how to promote, exempt them from taxes, exempt them from taxes, etc., etc. The crown was trying to prevent the abuses for the same reason, the abuses of the people of the crown in the field. There were several laws preventing the abuses against the indigenous people, not because the crown was a non-profit organization, precisely for the contrary, because they needed a social balance to keep taxes coming and sustaining. That's the key to understand the.
So were they populating with Spanish, or?
At times with Spanish, with Mexicans, with Filipinos.
Mexicans? Interesting. Because of the galleon route.
Right. Until 1815.
So that would be the genetic makeup by the 1800s.
Yes. With the unique point that the center of gravity of the identity remained Chamorro. Instead of switching to, like in Cuba or in Puerto Rico, where we find the same reality and there is a new identity, it's like the Chamorro identity had been flexible enough to survive that different
Influx.
and retain the center of gravity. Chamorro is still Chamorro. You borrow 60% or 80% of Spanish words, and still is Chamorro. Now, going to the judiciary history of the Marianas, here is, for 10 years there was one judge assigned to Guam. Before that, it was the governor, the Spanish governor, who had the capacity to be the judge. In fact, when they sent the permanent, this is the seal, the juzgado de primera instancia, the court of first instance. I don't know if you use that term in English. The main court.
Trial court.
Yeah.
Lower court.
Even when the judge was here, he will implement the trials, but when he was removed, the governor had to, before implementing the sentence, he had to ask permission to Manila. He had to show the trial, to show the sentence, and wait for approval to implement the sentence. The public prosecutor, this is the letterhead of the public prosecutor in the 1880s, 1890s. And it was under the Real Audiencia, the main court, the highest court in Manila. The building, I think, is still there in Intramuros. Since 1594, the Real Audiencia. There was one in Mexico, one in the Philippines, where judges will sit and decide. They had the same capacity than the governor. It was a way to control the authority of the governor in the Philippines and the governors in the provinces. The office of the public prosecutor. Now, about, and to close, because I know I'm talking too much, about the existence of a national identity the same way. If we find these realities in other Spanish colonies, national identity, how come it was not going to be in the Marianas? By default, we have to assume that it was there. It's just that it's not reflected in the conventional literature about it. This is one of the officers, Spanish officers, who I met at the center, and he wrote his autobiography. And he talks about the 1870s, he talks about Luis Baza, etc., about the revolution. And he says about the revolution, the event that impressed us most was the revolution of September and the departure from Spain of Queen Isabella II. Officials were replaced so scandalously, what scams, what a source of immorality, and what a terrible show for these people, for the Chamorros. Like, what a terrible show that the Spanish are supposed to be paragons of civilization, and there is this replacement. And he says, from that time dates the divorce between insulares and peninsulares, broken the ties that bound us. Peninsulares will be the Spanish born in Spain. Insulares will be the Spanish born in Guam. That, he says, from the 1870s dates the break between the two.
What do you mean the break? You mean that they now
The
together?
divorce. Yeah, the divorce of interests.
Oh.
But we had that in the American colonies, the English colonies.
Exactly the same.
Colonists, at one point, just,
They say, well, we can do the same thing on our own, right? That's the same, exactly. And then he says, many of the Spanish newcomers commented in the offices that the age of tyranny was over and that the new Spanish constitution, the peninsulares with indigenous, declaring them all Spanish citizens, another pile of nonsense. So the ambience of the revolution is really taking place in the palaces, on the government palace in Agaña. The officers are saying, and we have Luis Baza boasting about Republican ideas. If we do the math, he's there. And added to that, you put one political leader in every house of the Chamorros, like it happened with the deportees shortly after this. Of course it's going to have some kind of influence. It's not a political epiphany, like Chamorros are saying, wow, democracy, liberty. No, those realities didn't apply necessarily to the rural, pre-industrial reality of Guam. I don't think Chamorros needed that revelation to know, but I think there is one turning point in these years, and that's why one of the soldiers later on, a few years later, kills the governor at that one insult. He says, in truth these ideas lasted little, but the seed germinated for falling in good soil. It doesn't get more explicit than this. It's very clear. Now we understand why, when Captain Glass comes, few months after, there is a delegation of Chamorro prominent citizens of Agaña sending a request to be citizens of the United States. If that trend is already there, and that's the second historic betrayal that I would say is happening. First, when the Spanish missionaries arrived, and Christianity is twisted into the labor exploitation, betraying the principles of Christianity for generations. And the second main betrayal, it happened when the people of Guam was denied what they were entitled to, and they were demanding it, and they continue to demand. Now, well, this is summarizing what I have been saying. Chamorros were Spanish nationals. They were protected against blackbearders and the abusers of whalers. Chamorro soldiers captured notorious blackbearder Bully Hayes on April 12 near Uruna. Lack of indigenous participation in decision making was one of the main characteristics of these times. Let's just keep it in mind. There was a limited efficiency of the legal system.
Blackbearder is like a pirate.
Yeah. Traders that were kidnapping people to sell them as slaves.
Oh, okay. Slavers.
Yeah. Now, the fact that Luis Baza won the case does not obscure the fact that this efficiency was limited. It was not the only case that there were denounces and they didn't succeed in other occasions. The efficiency was limited. And all in all, there was a growth of a sense of entitlement among the Chamorro people that is recorded as such, at least since the 1850s. The people of Agaña, they are full of pretensions and privileges, and they know their rights and they exploit it at every time. It doesn't get more literal than that. Now, in the light of this that I'm telling you, imagine how it feels to know. I mean, I love Chamorro Village. Don't take me wrong. This is the logo. This is one sample of how diachronic is our perception of the past. in which we represent the indigenous, the pre-Christian or whatever, the ancient times, none of the terms I like it, but the ancient Chamorro times, simultaneous with technologies and realities that arrive later on in historic times. The wheel, the wheel, the road, there is need for roads because without roads you cannot have wheel. The Carabao, since 1771, this changes how Guam is. That's when I hear now they want to remove the Spanish words from the Chamorro. I think if we remove Latin from the Spanish, we run out of Spanish. There's nothing. If we remove French from the English, it's the same process. And yet, that being said, it's true that the dignity and the validity of the indigenous knowledge that has been disregarded, showed with contempt, ignored, insulted for generations, it needs to be put back in place. So there is this difficult balance in which I know nothing about. I'm just studying it. That being said, thank you for your attention and your patience. And again, if there is any question.
Excellent.